Welcome back to MSP Confidential, folks. Luis Giraldo, your host here. I'm Chief Evangelist at ScalePad. It's a pleasure to have you join us for the live stream. We're here every Friday from noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern onwards, usually for about an hour. And today I have the great pleasure of welcoming a good friend, a guy that goes way back with me, Mr. Todd Kane from Evolve Management Consulting. Todd, welcome to the live stream. And how are you, bud?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me on.
We've been like ships in the night lately. You've been coming through Vancouver. I've been out of town. I go to conferences that you're not attending, vice versa. And so I feel like we've not spent enough time together this year, but I'm glad you decided to accept my invite to come on MSP Confidential to talk about some of those spicy and juicy topics that you're often talking about online as well yourself.
Well, I had to get the social fix and see you somehow. So glad to be here and chat on some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about anyway. I love talking about this stuff, so may as well talk with you about it.
That's awesome. Well, you do talk a lot about it, and there's probably maybe two or three things that I see you constantly out in market with. The service desk conversation, service desk efficiency, KPIs, metrics. In fact, you and I had a little conversation about that's on the YouTube channel from a while back. And one other area that you spend a lot of time talking about is projects. This is a critical revenue stream for a lot of MSPs. It's aside from recurring revenue, this is the number one other thing I would say that is a critical driver of business growth and maintaining any kind of connectivity into the tissue of the businesses that MSPs are supporting overall, improving their baseline of their security or their infrastructure or any of the other initiatives that maybe go a little bit deeper than just infrastructure potentially as well. And so you spent some time with the Empath guys. You're one of the tribal elders on the Tech Tribe as well, talking a lot about projects and service desk. How did you find yourself getting into this maybe project domain so specifically? And perhaps it's a little bit of your background in IT yourself.
Yeah, and they're related actually because before I came to the MSP space, I was actually more in co-managed and project environments because the organization that I worked for quite a while, kind of early on in my career, was a more traditional VAR and working with enterprise and mid market. So I ran a multi-million dollar business unit that most of my team was deployed internally inside our clients, and they lived there pretty much full time. And the other component of that was a lot of project management, both for the teams that were working there, but also just an extension PS team that did more infrastructure projects for both the clients that I managed with that team, but also other clients across the portfolio. So in a lot of ways, project is my first love, and then MSP came later. And the things that I think are important about this, and the sort of the how they come together, is enterprise project management is really important, and it's very technical, high scale. There's you noted sort of the importance of good project management as a component of the MSP business model, but honestly we don't need as much of it. Just to put a frame of reference on this, I'll often have people ask me, should I get one of my team to get a PMP, which is the project management professional certification? And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, sure, it's great, it's a good designation, but let's be realistic. We're not building bridges in hospitals. We're just installing Wi-Fi and setting up servers and deploying workstations. So, it's kind of overkill. And what I really want to bring to people is, what are the components of the PMP and that project approach that we can kind of boil down to its essence and utilize in our day-to-day, so that we're better with projects in the MSP space as well.
Now, project management and management of project teams is maybe two separate streams in a way, because there's one is the truly the tactical operational component of project management, but then there's the people side of it. And projects are so interesting, I think, from the perspective of they readily provide a bit of that dopamine hit. There are people that would never work in any other arm of the business except projects because they really get a fix from just being on something new every day or just a different project that doesn't last more than a week or 2 weeks. And sort of the interesting challenge maybe that exists for people in the MSP industry is the stamina of doing the same thing for extended periods of time. And so this is why I see a lot of people just love the idea of projects. What has been sort of your take on this over many years of working with teams of all sizes in the project arena?
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, there is a novelty factor to projects because you're typically not necessarily working on a single project at a time. So there is sort of multiple things that you can kind of dip your toes in through the week and get exposure to all kinds of different technologies. In a lot of ways, it's where sort of people aspire to get to in their career when they're working on a help desk. It feels like sort of the next step up in the ladder from a technical career perspective. So a lot of people want to get towards the project realm and feel sort of once they get there, then they've maybe achieved something or they're past the service work. And that's something I really caution people about is if you're big enough MSP that you actually have a dedicated resources for projects, that's great because of the success that you've had to do that. But you want to make sure that no one ever gets sort of too big and inflated on themselves, and everyone should
Mm.
always be willing to contribute to service. And if you're not busy with projects, you should be contributing to the service desk. And then for most MSPs, it ends up that your project resources are shared resources anyway. So it's usually an owner or a T3, tier three technician that is working on projects, but then they're also fielding escalations and making sure they have to kind of dip back. And this causes a ton of friction and causes a lot of delays and in timeliness and our ability to execute on the projects because we're constantly sort of being sucked back into service projects are important, but they're never really urgent either. So, do you want to deal with this escalation, or do you want to focus on this project that realistically you can get back to tomorrow? Like, there's nothing that's going to stop you from doing that. So, techs, despite their salty exterior, they really want to help, and they don't like saying no to people. So, if someone asks for their help in a DM and they're supposed to be spending the next 3 hours working on this project, they're going to help that person out and ditch the project for a little while, right?
First of all, how dare you call tech salty? Secondly, I was curious to ask you. I mean, one of the things you do is you consult with MSPs on everything ranging from service desk efficiency projects, of course. And it immediately made me wonder what are maybe the top things that you have to undo, bad behaviors you have to undo to sort of rebuild a bit of the project mindset or the project process inside of your average MSP. And is there even like, can we really even talk about an average MSP mantra in that context? Like, it feels like everybody does things their own way to a certain extent, but what are the top things you undo?
Yeah, so to that point, that's one of the things that I say I love about this industry is like consulting with multiple MSPs. Everyone inherently has the same business model, and no one operates the same way. So it's kind of like what the puzzle should look like, but all the pieces are different every time you're
Mm.
engaging, which is pretty fun as well. I think one of the things that really strikes me as strange about our industry is we've moved away from this time and materials model to this MSP model, which is fantastic because it has leverage. We're not trading time for dollars. We set up a value based contract, and the more efficiency that we can eke into our day to day life in supporting that client, the more money that we can make. Then we go and sell projects on a line by line and time and materials basis. So why are we ditching why MSP is such a grand business model to go back to T&M? And that just makes no sense to me. So one of the things that I really advocate for people is fixed fee contracts because
Mm.
you know how much you're going to make, and this is the deliverables that the client is going to get. So why is there any discussion about when and how you should be paid for that? Like one of the I think cardinal sins that a lot of MSPs do is that they sell a project and then they go out and buy a bunch of equipment and then they invoice the client. Like, why are you doing this? Like you don't have the cash flow to be a bank. Don't act like a bank. So if you can get into a space where you're selling fixed fee contracts and go back to that leveraged model of if I can be more efficient at this instead of getting 25 35 even 40% margin on a project, all of a sudden you can lever up to potentially 50 or even 60% margin on projects, right? It's very doable. It's not easy. There's systems that you have to get in place to make that practical, but that's what we should be tracking back towards, is working on that leverage model into the project model as well.
Yeah, I think maybe let's talk a little about that margin piece, because the average MSP is 10 and under. There's not a
Mhm.
ton of oversight on project efficiency, so to speak, or project or the sinking margins of projects as time goes by. And so I feel like this is maybe an area that is ripe for disruption, just from the perspective of like understanding how to deploy simple KPIs, even for a small team, to track the delivery of projects and where the time is going, and where that efficiency might sort of leak out of the bottom of the bucket. But what is your sense on things that are reasonably possible for a smaller MSP to do? Because well, you're gonna, I know what you're gonna say. You're gonna say time tracking, but but we're back to the conversation about hourly tracking, right? There's like a clash of values here. We're trying to sell fixed fee, but then tracking and delivering based on line item hourly basis, and so this is inherently a challenge for me. But back to the original question, and maybe we'll branch off into the other stuff. What can small MSPs do to get better oversight and control over their project efficiency without really having to hire somebody to oversee it?
Okay, so let's frame this conversation with basically the four alarm fire that I've been talking about in our industry. The stat that I've always really sort of loved throwing around is from service leadership, in that a full 25% of the industry is break even or losing money. The 2023 stat for that service leadership does, the largest benchmarking pool in the industry. So they've got a lot of data on this. 2023 said that 28% of the entire industry of MSPs is break even or losing money. This is an incredibly damning and alarming stat to begin with. The
Yikes.
crazy part is that has always been the case. Like going back to like 2018, 2017, when they started tracking these numbers, that has always been that way. The interesting part that I saw this year, Peter Kajawa, VP of Service Leadership, put out this quote blurb that said, digging a little deeper into this, that quartile that is break even or losing money, shockingly, they're actually profitable on service, but they're so bad at project management, it cannibalizes all of the rest of the profits. And that's why they're break even or losing money. In conjunction with that, I've also started to see a shift in why people are seeing churn in their client base. And it used to be because of failed service, and they just weren't meeting SLAs. They weren't providing a high quality of service and support for their clients. And now people like the sort of the low barrier or the low watermark has come up on service. People have generally gotten better at providing good service, and now they're losing clients on project failures. So that's why, again, I've really been kind of ranting about this all year. Is this is a systemic problem in the industry that we don't tend to focus on a lot, right? Like, how can a quarter of the industry be losing money?
Yeah.
And 90% of the reason is projects, and we don't talk much about it, right?
That's wild. And I think, back to the comment about the smaller MSP, the projects are delivered by the owner,
Right.
the senior technicians who maybe are not so committed to the time tracking and understanding where the efficiency of the project lies. And then in the spectrum of people entering the space, I think the more immature MSPs are obviously just still finding out what resourcing is needed for every kind of project. And
Sure.
it's not until you've been in the business a few years that you start to really get a sense of like, oh yeah, this is what that project typically looks like, and we can account for it from a pricing perspective, and then of course the service delivery of it. But it's interesting that the fixed fee model of projects also takes a bit of the pressure off the MSP, believe it or not. Yes, you want to be efficient, but at the same time, you don't have the pressure of like looking badly to the client that this is costing more money than it should, because it was fixed fee, and then you're
Right.
going to learn on the job, paid rehearsal, so to speak. And so maybe tell me a little bit about what you see there, and reconciling a bit of like the come to Jesus moment of, we got to stop doing this because
Yeah.
obviously we're not going to be profitable.
So sorry, I got busy on my rant about the project profitability. I neglected the question originally, so I apologize. I was just trying to frame it. So now that I've framed that situation, Luis, some of the things that MSPs can do, like obviously what we talked about is they're sharing resources with service and suffering under the tyranny of now, where service and this firefighting all day every day gravitate pulls has this major gravity that pulls people away from projects and back to service because it just seems more important at the time. So one of the things that I think is really practical about doing this is, if when you assign someone to a project, you have to create a firewall around them, and that you say like, booking people in 2 to 4 hour increments to work on that project so they can go heads down and exclusively work on that thing and not have to defend themselves with escalations and shoulder taps. So if you're scheduling that, and what you say to sort of the rest of the team and drive this as a cultural behavior, and get people to actually turn off Teams and not check their email while they're in that dedicated time. And if you actually need an escalation, you have to go through somebody else. So you actually either need to escalate through a service manager or a team lead or some third party, so that someone else can go, did you check the documentation? Did you read previous tickets? Did you ask someone else, right? All of these sort of basic questions. And if they do a bit of troubleshooting and they're like, well, okay, maybe we do need, Chris's input on this. Let's go interrupt him. But at least like he can focus more on that project in that period of time, because someone else is defending his time for him. So I think that that's a really important component of this. And then the other piece that I think is really practical is people need to get better at scoping and managing scope. And a lot of that includes sort of how you're speccing the cost of a project. What you tend to see is a lot of technical owners, they'll sort of like put a thumb up in the air and they're like, yeah, I think this is about 30 hours. And then they quote the project, get it sold, and then they bring it back to the tech team. They're like, here's this project, it's got 30 hours, here's the deliverables, this is what we're going to do. Tech team looks at it and they're like, this is like 40 hours of work. Like you've already put us behind the 8 ball, and either this project is going to run over, or we're going to have to eat the cost, and we end up in eroding our profitability. So the other piece is making sure whoever is going to deliver that project has seen and qualified and approved whatever is being quoted to the client before it's sold. So, because this is really important down the line, if you're actually going to measure them on performance, they have to have an ability to control it. And if you're controlling the amount of time they have to work on projects, you can't reasonably tell them, I'm going to judge you on whether or not you're on time and on budget, because they didn't tell you what the budget should have been in the first place, right?
Well, how loosey-goosey in your experience has even the tracking of performance and metrics with projects been for the average MSP? And again, there's a whole spectrum of this,
Yeah.
and obviously it's critical for every size of MSP to do it to some extent. But when it's a shared service, I find it gets increasingly difficult to really separate those two areas of the work that's being delivered by any one tech, of course.
Yeah, this is a huge problem because there's just not a level of sophistication with a lot of MSPs' finances that they even have visibility into projects as a separate entity. So it's no wonder they don't know how much it's costing them in damaging their profits, right? Because if you typically ask an owner, they'll know off the top of the head how much revenue they have. Some of them may know how much they have in profit and or margin. It's a smaller community. But then if you ask, how margin do you make on service? How much margin do you make on cloud? How much margin do you make on projects? They probably won't know. And even if they go to their QuickBooks or whatever accounting system they're looking at, those are like the service team and your COGS for service and projects are usually merged. You can't separate them. So until you get to that level of sophistication of splitting these things out, it's really difficult to sort of measure what kind of impact projects are having, other than just sort of these high level heuristics that you should start with of, was this project on time and on budget, right? But that's still like, that's a 10,000 foot view of whether or not this is actually working out. Which maybe gets to one of the other questions that was in there in the previous question of like, how should we be thinking about this, and how should we be managing projects, especially in smaller environments? And one of the things that I think people get really wrong about project management is that it's not technical. And some of the best project managers I've seen in MSPs were originally office managers or a non-technical dispatcher. It has to be someone who maybe has enough people skills that they can kind of challenge people. They're sort of warm and slightly charismatic, but they have to also just be process oriented, right? Like, this is the system that we use in order to manage projects. And if we do this, then we tend to end up in a pretty good spot. But if we just manage these things off the side of someone's desk with no process around projects, it's no wonder it's going to go wrong. So I think we're wasting time and energy trying to have owners and T3s manage projects, when reasonably we can have a low-cost resource that starts as a project coordinator and just sort of runs the program for people. They're providing updates. They're asking people for the status of things. Like, it's a program plan that we can run and doesn't require any knowledge of what is actually being done. There are occasions where a smart technical person will start blowing smoke and obscuring kind of what's happening and pull the wool over somebody's eyes, but as long as you have a strong technical person to validate off of, then that can be mitigated pretty quickly anyway.
Hmm. Well, what's the biggest lever you think at that early stage of starting to get your arms around the challenge of projects overall, that if you had to prioritize over doing any other one thing, would be the thing that maybe sets up the best foundation for delivering projects more efficiently or more successfully?
Uh, I would. I don't know that it's one thing necessarily. I think it is sort of the program plan. If I had to pick one thing out of those, I would be. I would. So the program plan at a high level is how are we quoting and selling projects? Then there's a kickoff, there's the execution, and the close. Those are sort of the high level components of good project management. I would probably have to choose between a kickoff and a close. More likely, maybe the close is more important, and there's a couple reasons why. One is unless you're doing kind of a close meeting for your project management, there's no learning that can be applied in the future, right? And management is about being able to affect the future, because whatever has happened has happened. It doesn't really matter. This kind of gets aside. I'll go at a sidebar. Remind me to bring me back track if I get too far off on this. But I
I
love
love your
people to be future.
sidebars.
Okay, so I love people to be future focused, especially in management, but particularly in project management, because nothing infuriates me more in going into a project management meeting and there's 6 people sitting around the table. The PM is basically doing a round robin one-on-one, and while everyone else is doing other work, this is already a categorical waste of time. And they ask for an update on a particular status or a status of a task that's red. What are we doing about this? And they're like, oh, you wouldn't believe this was supposed to happen, and so did this, and this vendor wasn't ready, and we had to wait for all of this. It's like, okay, great story. What are we doing about this? So I call this no stories rule in project management. When someone starts to tell you like a story about why something hasn't happened, you say, look, sorry, I'm going to stop you. We can talk about this offline if you want, if there's some learnings that we can pull out of this, but I need to know what is the next action that we're going to take in order to get this back on track. That's the only thing that matters, because it's the only part of the project that you can influence, is what's the
Hmm.
next thing that we can do to be successful. So that's wrapping that back to the closure meeting. That's a really, really important component to that, because if you keep quoting a particular piece of a project for 12 hours and it consistently takes your team 18 hours to do it, you're constantly shooting yourself in the foot. And in some way, you should know this, right? And the other component of closure meetings that's really, really important is documentation, because I'm sure you can appreciate this. The number of times it's like, hey, is this project done? Yeah, we're all wrapped up, I'm moving on to this other project. And you're like, is the documentation complete? They're like, I'll work on it this weekend. No, they won't. They won't work it on this weekend. They're off to the other thing, back to this novelty and dopamine addiction from the top. So at that closure, you need to have someone else validate that the documentation has actually been updated. Because I've talked to service people that woke up on a Monday morning, spent 3 hours fighting with some server that was offline. Finally, 3 hours later, when the tier 3 team shows up, they're like, "Oh yeah, we decommed that thing on the weekend." It's like, well, man, that like would have been nice to know, instead of spending all morning fighting a ghost server, right?
And speaking of documentation, since I spent maybe a couple minutes in that area a few years ago, I do find that documentation is an area that's often left out of the project scoping of most projects, and
Yes.
often is one of the biggest drivers of inefficiency, just from a pure project margin perspective, because it could take a little bit of time to complete the documentation, make sure everything's accurate, remove all the stuff that was decommed, preventing all these issues for the service desk. And so one of the things that I started to hear MSPs doing a lot of is the last check and balance of a project delivery was the actual service team accepting that the project was done,
Yes.
not the project team saying that the project was done. Have you seen a bit of this sort of play out in real life?
100%. Like that's one of the recommendations that I make in the closure, is that the project team shows up, and you may remember this from FM as well. Like this was the process: when you finish a project, you attend the service huddle in the morning to say, here's the client, this is the project we did, these are the changes that were made, this is where the documentation's been updated, this is the person you should contact if there's issues post support, right? So and this goes a long way to defending why defending the projects team, because the service team quite rightly has a very negative view of project teams in a lot of cases, because they do what they view as swoop and poop, right? They come
Gunslingers.
in, they fix up everything, they make a bunch of changes, and they shit all over everything, and then they leave, right? And if they don't know what's been changed, they don't know how to support it. That is an accurate view and reasonable for them to feel that that's a problem. So yeah, absolutely, the service team should be involved in making sure that yes, this is a thumbs up, that the documentation makes sense, and I feel I can practically support this going forward. You touched on one thing that I do want to mention as well. Is another huge sin in project management, and another reason to support fixed fee engagements. Actually, I would say probably 70 or even 80% of MSPs don't charge for project management time or documentation, and this is a massive, massive problem. So I have this calculator that we use for scoping in projects when I'm working on this, and it's in a project management course that I have that is it's built in where it automatically adds 10% contingency and 15% project management. And again, if you're selling on fixed fee, this is a lot more practical, because if you're selling on a line by line item and the client is somewhat frugal, goes through this line by line, they're like, $2,500 for project management. How about I just have, my office manager or my VP do that project management? We can strike this out. Like, how about that? It's no is the answer. We do project management internally, and we have to do it well. So if it's time spent, it should be paid for, right? You just because it's difficult to sell, there are ways around that, right? So kind of maybe a separate tangent we can go on, but you should not be giving away your time just because you don't think that the client will support it. It needs to be done, and therefore should be paid for. Oh, lost your audio.
There we go. I
Yep.
love that Toddism that you dropped there. There's been a couple already. The tyranny of now, the North Stories rule. I think that's the first time I hear you say that one. Cool story, bro. Hashtag. But what are we gonna do about it, right? And there's probably a couple others that I've heard you say over the years. One of them is tools don't solve people problems, and I feel like project management is squarely in that category of it's
Yes.
a very people driven thing, managing expectations, managing communication. And this is a place where a lot of things fall down. And to the comment you made about huddles, that transition from the project team to the service team, I wanted to ask you if you've seen some material, maybe failures around the communication piece, because in the land of Teams and or Slack that we live in today, I feel like people feel like the huddle can be replaced by that sort of offline asynchronous communication. But the huddle, I still find, is so valuable to make sure everybody's on the same page with stuff. What are your thoughts around huddles specifically? Is this something MSPs should generally be doing more and such?
Yeah, I think you should. Not only because of the implication of projects, but certainly because of the service end of things, right? So it's a place for there to be cross departmental communication that's intentional, right? Those handoffs of this project is complete, service, these are the things that you need to know. Let us know if you have any issues. So that's a very practical thing to do. But the other things that huddles are really good for is, how did we perform yesterday? What are things that are on deck today? And what do we need to think about and focus on in order to be successful? So you're setting yourself up for success if you're doing this right. Like some simple examples that have real world implications is telling people that we've got 3 on-sites today. Here are the clients that people are visiting, rather than not knowing that someone was deployed to a client and then you dispatch somebody else to go reset a router or fix something physically wrong on a client site, not recognizing someone was just there 3 hours ago, right? So there's a massive amount of inefficiency that can be borne out in this. And from an operations and KPIs perspective, I'm a dashboard nut. I love sort of data to be able to understand this. Being able to reflect on how are we doing so far this week and understanding what the implications for that are today is really powerful to focus the team on what's important. So here are the KPIs I want you guys to focus on today. Call answers are getting a little long. Can you guys focus on picking up on like in under 2 rings, that kind of stuff, right? So really focusing people on where are we, what do we need to focus on today is a huge benefit with huddles, I think.
Yeah, I found whenever we did huddles that the simple piece of the group accountability was actually really powerful. let's say you're just giving your quick update. And by the way, Todd, I'm going to need some help at 3 p.m. if you have the time to help me look at this issue. Now everybody's heard that you were going to give a hand with that, or that a person needed an assist with that. And that maybe is probably one of the biggest value drivers of the huddles that I recall, because it was just always creating a bit of that group accountability. It's so hard to do that, even one on one, never mind the group, that the huddle kind of does that for people.
Yeah, I like that idea, and it's one of the things that I advocate for huddles as well. Is like it removes a lot of false narratives that get built up in people's heads,
Mm.
right? Like they're waiting, like tech team or project team is waiting for a quote, and they're thinking in their head, oh, that sales guy, he's so lazy, he's not done this. And if you just sort of short circuit that and be like, hey Steve, remember, I'm still waiting for that quote for this project so we can get started on procurement. And he's like, oh crap, right, sorry, yeah, it's on my desk, I'll have it to you by the end of the day, right? Like he just forgot. Don't call the guy a lazy you know what, and make all these false assumptions about what's happening. You can just short circuit that with quick crisp communication and make things happen instead, right?
Except for texts, those are always salty, right? Where you make that clear.
But they
You've
will say
stated, you've
yes.
claimed.
Just tell them it's urgent.
Yeah, no, and we're just playing, of course. Nobody's
Yeah.
salty. Yeah. So one of your other Toddisms that I do hear quite often, and you go on the occasional LinkedIn rant on this one, is to ban the word busy. It's such a crutch. I've also started to say that. And I find myself, when people ask me, where my natural reaction in the past would have been, oh, it's been so busy, I specifically just give like a very optimist, positive answer. And I find it's actually quite contagious for people to hear you just come out with an unexpected response. Like, how are you doing lately? I've been incredible. I've been doing so great. These are the things I've been working on. I'm so excited about this, and the other thing. And people, you can see their like sort of disposition change right in front of your
Yeah.
eyes. It's actually really interesting. But what's your take on this word busy? How much of a crutch
Yeah,
is it?
I hate the word busy. I love that, like your comment on infectious positivity that can result from this. That's amazing. So yeah, like busy is a useless adjective. It just does not describe anything that has happened, and it is used as a crutch, right? So what have you done? How come this deliverable didn't get completed? I was busy. Okay, what does that mean, right? And that's why I like this challenge. I tell people, go back to your team, sit them down. Usually you want to do this kind of physically to like really bring the gravity to this, but if you need, you can send an email. But like hold a quick meeting and say, hey, I got a challenge for you guys. Over the next 2 weeks, none of us are allowed to use the word busy. Right. So this is the ban busy challenge. And this is a ton of fun, actually, because you'll see these weird interactions with people where like they're like, hey, how are things? It's just like, oh, it's so oh, hang on. They're like, you can't say busy, right? And then you have to actually think about what have I done, which is instructive, both from a peer perspective and also from management. And quite frankly, saying busy just is a short form way of saying I prioritized something else, right? If you've missed a deliverable, everyone has the same amount of time, right? You're either overwhelmed with the work that you have, or like you're not able to sort of focus on the work and you're off on 10 different things. All of that is a prioritization management issue, right? And this comes to the tyranny of now as well, that we're so focused on whatever the last fire is that we're so focused on these urgent priorities, we never get to the important pieces. And all of that is a function of we just feel we're too busy. And if we could just sit back and say, look, I've got 30 things to do, but these 3 things are priority, and these 2 are not actually urgent, but I need to get them done this week, right? And actually blocking them into your calendar to make sure that they get accomplished. This is a massive step forward from a productivity perspective
Mm.
for your team. And I actually loved doing this. Like, I'm sure you've kind of seen this experience, Luis, where you see one of the team member that's really flustered and they're just overwhelmed with all the work that they have, and I'd be like, all right, stop, you're kind of spinning out. Let's go into the boardroom. Let's figure this out. And I would draw the 2x2 matrix for an Eisenhower, and then just start a list. I'm like, tell me everything that you think you have to do, right? And just start brainstorming a list down the whiteboard of all the things that they think they're responsible for, and then we just start sorting through them. We're like, okay, this one, like that can wait. This can wait. That can wait. This one, like, which of these do you think you'll get in trouble with from your boss, from a client, somebody else? They like somebody's gonna scream at you or send a nasty note to somebody if you don't get them done. Okay, these 3 things, those are the only things you need to focus on. You can see sort of they relax, right? Because they don't feel this overwhelm of the 30 things they have to do. They can just focus on the 3 that are primarily important in the moment, right?
But we're in IT, man. We're heroes. We like to make everybody happy and do everything for everybody as much as we can. Which brings me to one of your Toddisms, or maybe spicy takes that we were talking about backstage before we started the recording. And it's this idea of well, we're talking about accountability here to some extent. And the idea of dispatchers, it seemed like you had a really strong opinion about dispatchers at MSPs, which are assigning tickets, doing triage, doing project, follow-ups and stuff like that. Not necessarily project managing, but doing a little bit of that dispatch piece on the service desk. Why is this a spicy topic? What do you think's going on there?
Because I think in 80% of cases, dispatchers are used as an administrative band-aid because the team, the owner or the manager can't get the team to do the things that they're naturally accountable for in their work, right? Manage your queue, enter your time, provide good service, communicate with the client. When those things aren't happening, there's not enough force and confidence from the owner, like the managers of those teams, to say, look, like this is a fundamental part of your job, and if you continue to not do these things, you will not have a job anymore. And I love this. I've had this client. They had a screenshot from the president of the company that said, you do timesheets or you don't work here. And then it had her name underneath this, right? And this would occasionally get passed around just as a reminder of this is not optional. So dispatchers are often there because we can't keep the techs accountable to doing these things. So therefore we have to do it for them, which is sort of an administrative waste of money. And also we're creating a barrier between service and the people that are requesting service. And it's an unnatural barrier and doesn't really need to be there, in my opinion. There is a small caveat I will make to this. I am a fan of service coordinators. And some people will say, well, it's a different name for the same role. And it sort of is, but it focuses things in a different area, right? So when you get to a certain size as an MSP, it starts to make sense to become a podded structure. It's not always the case, but it can be helpful. Service coordinators inside each of those pods can be helpful. Or you can have a service coordinator that sits at that T1 level if you want. And what they primarily focus on is client communication and updates, right? So, you've got a tech who's been on the phone for an hour, like trying to get something fixed, and they've missed a ticket. You don't necessarily need to move it around for them or reschedule, but you can reach out to the client and say, hey, look, Steve is working on this issue. He's kind of caught up right now. We hope to have him reach out to you within the hour. Is that okay? Right? And even if that is not okay, someone will reasonably usually say, oh, okay, fine, sure. Right? The difference between having that update of it's going to take another hour versus no one called you when they were supposed to is a massive difference in the quality of service. So there is a place for service coordinators. There is also a place for dispatchers, but dispatchers to me is a blended role or a responsibility within the roles, right? So what we did at the MSP that we worked at was the dispatcher was just a hat that was passed around on a day-to-day or a week-to-week basis. And what that meant is this person was designated as the person that was primary for answering phones and primary for cleaning the queue and getting things set up so that other people could self-dispatch, right? Because if you're trying to defend against cherry picking, that's a cultural issue, right? People know that they're not supposed to do that. It doesn't mean that you need to have somebody else assign tickets so they don't do that. You need to train them not to do that. That's the difference. So the dispatcher as a role within that group, and if it's a shared responsibility, they're more likely to be accountable to each other because they know that they're going to be asking their peers the same requests of, hey, can you drop what you're doing and pick this thing up for me? That would be really great. Because next week they're going to be making that same request. They're more likely to comply and sort of help out because they know what that feels like. And the thing that really bothers me about what happens to dispatchers in our industry is I've seen numerous occasions where a dispatcher who is primarily a female with non-technical capabilities is trying to boss around a bunch of people that know a ton of stuff about things that they don't, and that person has no authority over these technical people. And it's incredibly frustrating that they can't do their job and everyone continues to ignore them. And I've seen lots of people end up in tears because they're just like, I am trying to do my job and no one will listen to me, and like everyone's unhappy. It just feels like a recipe for disaster in so many cases. Yeah.
Well, I think you may have literally rattled off a list of things that should replace the fluffy core values that a lot of people have on their walls. Manage your queue, enter your time, communicate. Like those would be so much better and more pragmatic core values, I think, for the average MSP that struggles with even these basic things, right?
I think not necessarily values. I think because that feels too militant of a way to view this is like shut up and do your job. Like that's not what I'm suggesting, right? And I often come across that way as like being very cold, calculated, and efficient. But I am very much for a positive culture. It's just I think my feeling is like people want to win. They want to be on a high performance team. And if you constantly set the bar so low that everyone's just sort of phoning it in all day, why would anyone excel or overperform in that environment? Why should I work harder because the person next to me is not? That doesn't seem fair, right? And techs are very focused on fair. They're not necessarily driven by money. They want to have some level of respect and to feel that they work in a fair environment. That is much more important to them in most cases.
Hmm.
So I think that fairness is a lot more important. And that goes to sort of that cultural component that I love saying is culture is defined by what you tolerate, right? And it's such a perfect way to sort of encapsulate this of whatever is the worst thing, worst behavior that you're accepting and not correcting in your organization is where your culture starts, right? And you want to lift that bar up so that there's just a general higher level of expectation of what people are responsible for in your organization. What that does is it becomes infectious, and everyone else starts to positively compete rather than just sort of like working to the minimum, right?
Well, I got to say this next thing lovingly, Todd. I've known you for a long time, and it seems like your level of tolerance has maybe diminished over the years. You're a little bit more opinionated and more specific about the things that you'll let people do and not do, which is probably a great thing in the situation that you find yourself in, which is actually training and coaching people on how to get better at this. And so tell people how to find your project course, your project management stuff, because I know this is super valuable for every MSP of many sizes. Even the big ones are sometimes very inefficient and immature at this process.
Yeah, so if you want to find me, then itisabusiness.com is a great place. It's a little easier to sort of rattle off than my website, which is evolved with a D, mgmt.com. Or reasonably, you can just hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. I'm usually in a lot of those communities and always happy to chat about this stuff. Like if you see me at a conference, pull me aside and start asking me questions because I will continue to rant exactly like this. Like I truly enjoy this stuff and really, really find it fun to talk about. So
Well, Todd, I truly enjoy always having these conversations with you. There's probably so much more to unpack on the individual and maybe more specific mechanics of several parts of the project management delivery process. Because you gave like this five step framework for projects overall, and maybe we'll start a little series and get into each one in a little bit more detail over time. But I wanted to thank you for coming on, making a little bit of time to join me on the live stream. Folks, this is Todd Kane. He's a really, really smart dude, and I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions about project management, or if you want to bring him in to work with your MSP to have a little bit of a come to Jesus moment on how you might be getting more efficient on your project delivery services overall. Todd, thank you so much for your time. To everybody else, thank you for joining us. We're here every Friday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern for MSP Confidential. You can find all our previous episodes on the website or on the YouTube channel. At Go Skillpad is our YouTube channel. And so we'll see you next week. And thanks again to you, Todd. Cheers.